It was a day like any other at the bustling private terminal of the airport. Rows of gleaming private jets lined the tarmac, their sleek designs shining under the bright midday sun. These aircraft weren't just transportation, they were symbols of wealth, exclusivity, and untouchable status. The kind of status most people could only dream of. Pilots and ground crew moved briskly, catering to their elite clientele who arrived in chauffeured cars, their every whim attended to. Among this world of high luxury, a single figure stood out. She was a black woman, her presence confident yet understated. Her posture was straight, her expression calm. She wasn't dressed in flashy designer clothes, nor did she arrive in a convoy of luxury vehicles. But there was something about her, an air of quiet assurance that caught the eye, even if it was hard to pinpoint why. Dana Richards wasn't the kind of person most people would expect to see at a private terminal. Here, the world operated on unspoken rules of exclusivity, and assumptions were made in an instant. To the crew and staff bustling about, Dana was out of place. As she stepped onto the tarmac, whispers began. "Who is she?" a ground staff member murmured to a colleague. "No idea," the other replied, glancing at her sideways. "Maybe she's lost." It was the kind of comment Dana had heard 100 times before. She didn't let it faze her. She adjusted her handbag on her shoulder and kept walking. Her eyes were fixed on one jet in particular, a sleek, silver aircraft with elegant curves and engines that purred even when silent. This jet wasn't just another plane, it was special. But as Dana approached, her quiet confidence caught the attention of the crew stationed nearby. They exchanged glances, and the pilot, a man in his early 50s with a neatly pressed uniform and a slight air of arrogance, stepped forward to intercept her. His body language said everything. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his tone polite but tinged with condescension. "This jet is reserved for a private client. If you're looking for someone, I suggest you check the main terminal." Dana paused, her expression unreadable. "I know where I'm going," she replied evenly. The pilot blinked, clearly taken aback by her calm demeanor. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering just a moment too long on her simple yet elegant outfit. It wasn't the kind of attire he was used to seeing in this environment. "Right," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But this jet is for very specific clientele. It's not open to people like me." Dana interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. The pilot hesitated, caught off guard. "I didn't mean it that way," he said quickly, though his body language betrayed his discomfort. "It's just that this is a highly restricted area." By now, other members of the crew had noticed the interaction. They stopped what they were doing, their curiosity piqued. A flight attendant, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a uniform that looked freshly pressed, walked over to join the pilot. She looked at Dana with a mix of suspicion and disbelief. "Is there something we can help you with?" the flight attendant asked, her tone polite but distant. "I'm here for this jet," Dana said simply, gesturing toward the aircraft behind them. Both the pilot and the flight attendant exchanged another glance, this one loaded with unspoken assumptions. "This jet," the pilot repeated slowly, as if confirming he'd heard her correctly. "Do you have a reason to be here? Are you with someone?" Dana took a deep breath. She had dealt with situations like this countless times before. She knew exactly what they were thinking. She didn't belong here, not in their eyes. "I'm not with anyone," Dana replied, her voice steady. "I'm here for my jet." Her words hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap. For a moment, there was silence. The pilot let out a nervous laugh, clearly convinced she must be joking. "Your jet? That's not possible," he said, shaking his head. "It's not?" Dana asked, raising an eyebrow. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her polished composure slipping just a fraction. "Ma'am," she said, her voice soft but firm, This jet belongs to one of our most exclusive clients. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Dana tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving theirs. I don't think there's any misunderstanding, she said. This jet is mine. The pilot's smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. I'm sorry, but that's just not possible, he insisted. This aircraft belongs to. Dana held up a hand, cutting him off. I know exactly who it belongs to, she said calmly. I suggest you take another look at your records before making any more assumptions. By now, a small crowd had started to gather at a distance. Other ground staff, curious passengers, and even a few bystanders had noticed the interaction and were watching with interest. Dana could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. The pilot hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He turned to the flight attendant. Check the manifest, he muttered under his breath. The flight attendant nodded and quickly pulled out a tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she accessed the jet's records. Her confident expression began to waver as she scanned the information. Sir, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. What is it? The pilot asked impatiently. The flight attendant looked up, her face pale. Her name, she said, gesturing toward Dana. It's on the ownership documents. The pilot blinked, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. What? It's right here, the flight attendant insisted, holding up the tablet. She's the registered owner of this aircraft. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd watching from a distance seemed to lean in, their curiosity turning into astonishment. Dana didn't say a word. She simply stood there, her expression calm, as the weight of the revelation settled over everyone present. The pilot's face turned a shade paler. There must be some kind of mistake, he stammered, his earlier arrogance replaced by nervous uncertainty. There's no mistake, Dana said firmly. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to board my jet. Her words were delivered with such quiet authority that the pilot and flight attendant stepped aside without another word. As Dana walked past them toward the jet, the whispers among the onlookers grew louder. Who is she? Someone asked. I think she owns the jet, another replied, their tone incredulous. Dana didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her actions had already said everything that needed to be said. And as she climbed the steps to her jet, the world around her began to understand one simple truth: Dana Richards wasn't just another traveler. She was the one they would be talking about for days to come. As Dana ascended the stairs to her jet, the whispers behind her grew louder. It was a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and awe. People weren't used to seeing someone like her in a position of such authority, especially not in this setting. To most of them, her calm confidence felt almost unreal. The pilot and flight attendant stood frozen, still processing what had just happened. The pilot's earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by a kind of nervous energy. He muttered something to the flight attendant, who was frantically scrolling through the tablet, double-checking the documents as though a mistake might still reveal itself. But there was no mistake. Dana Richards was, without question, the owner of the jet. Inside the aircraft, Dana took her time. She walked through the luxurious cabin, running her fingers along the buttery leather seats and admiring the meticulous design. It was hers, of course, but every detail still filled her with a quiet pride. She had worked for this, fought for this, and moments like these reminded her of just how far she had come. But this wasn't just about owning a jet. It was about something deeper. As Dana settled into one of the plush seats, she thought back to the countless times she had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. Her journey hadn't been easy. There were moments when it felt like the odds were stacked impossibly high against her. But she had learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for people like her. Outside, the crew began whispering among themselves. What do we do now? The flight attendant asked, her voice low. The pilot shook his head, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. "I don't know," he admitted. "This is unexpected." "She's really the owner," one of the ground staff nearby chimed in, clearly eavesdropping on the conversation. "Yes," the flight attendant replied, her voice laced with disbelief. "The documents are all here. Her name is right there, clear as day." The ground staff member whistled softly. "Well, she doesn't look like a jet owner," he said. The flight attendant shot him a sharp look. "You might want to keep that opinion to yourself," she said. Inside the jet, Dana made a quick call on her phone. She didn't need to say much, just a few concise instructions to her personal assistant to confirm her plans for the day. She spoke with the kind of efficiency that came from years of leading in high-stakes environments. But as she ended the call, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The flight attendant had climbed the stairs, her earlier confidence completely replaced by nervous energy. She stood at the doorway, hesitating, as though unsure of how to proceed. "Ms. Richards," she began, her voice cautious. I wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier." Dana looked up, her expression calm but unreadable. She let the moment linger, her silence stretching just long enough to make the flight attendant squirm. "Misunderstanding?" Dana repeated, her tone even. "Yes," the flight attendant said quickly. "We weren't aware that you were the owner of the jet. I assure you, if we had known." "If you had known," Dana interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "would you have treated me differently?" The flight attendant faltered. No, of course not," she stammered. "We always strive to provide the highest level of service to all our clients." Dana raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "Do you?" she asked simply. The flight attendant opened her mouth to reply but then closed it again, realizing there was no good answer to that question. Instead, she nodded awkwardly and stepped back, retreating down the stairs without another word. As the door closed and Dana was left alone in the cabin, her thoughts drifted back to the past. This moment wasn't just the result of hard work, it was a culmination of years of perseverance, resilience, and self-belief. Dana had grown up in a modest neighborhood, the youngest of 3 siblings. Her parents had instilled in her a strong sense of determination, always encouraging her to dream big despite the challenges they faced. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do," her mother used to say. "You decide what's possible for you." But the world wasn't always so supportive. In her early career, Dana had faced countless obstacles. She remembered the interviews where she was passed over for promotions she was more than qualified for, the meetings where her ideas were ignored until they were repeated by someone else, and the countless times her abilities were doubted simply because of who she was. But instead of letting those experiences break her, Dana used them as fuel. She worked harder, learned faster, and built a reputation for excellence that no one could deny. Over time, she climbed the ranks, moving from one opportunity to the next, each step bringing her closer to the life she had envisioned for herself. When she finally had the resources to purchase her own private jet, it wasn't just a luxury, it was a statement. A reminder that she had earned her place in spaces that weren't always welcoming. And now, as she sat in the cabin of her jet, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Not because she had proven herself to anyone else, but because she had proven herself to herself. Outside, the atmosphere had shifted. The pilot and the rest of the crew were now fully aware of who Dana was, and the realization was sinking in that their earlier behavior had consequences. "What do we do now?" the pilot asked, his voice low. "We wait," the flight attendant replied, her tone equally uncertain. But waiting wasn't enough. Dana had made up her mind. Moments later, she stepped off the jet and onto the tarmac, her heels clicking against the ground with a sense of purpose. The crew turned to face her, their expressions a mix of apprehension and regret. Dana didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried the weight of authority that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she deserved. "I've seen enough," she said simply. The crew exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was coming next. "I expect the people working for me to treat everyone with respect," Dana continued. "Not just me, but everyone. Clearly, that's not something you're capable of." "Ms. Richards, please," the pilot began, but Dana held up a hand to silence him. "Your behavior today was unacceptable," she said firmly. "And I don't have room on my team for people who can't see past their own biases." With that, she turned to one of the ground staff members who had been observing the scene. "Please make arrangements to have this crew replaced," she said calmly. The staff member nodded quickly, his expression a mix of surprise and respect. As Dana walked back to her jet, the whispers started again, but this time, they carried a different tone. There was no disbelief now, only admiration. Dana Richards had made her point. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone watching that respect wasn't just a privilege, it was a requirement. The woman's name was Dana Richards, a business magnate who had defied the odds at every turn. To those who knew her, she was a symbol of resilience and brilliance, a self-made success story in a world that didn't always welcome women like her. But here, on the tarmac of this private airport, she wasn't being treated like a titan of industry. She was being treated like an outsider. The flight attendant, a tall, impeccably dressed woman with a clipboard clutched tightly in one hand, stepped in front of Dana as she approached the steps of the sleek private jet. Her smile was thin, practiced, and devoid of any warmth. "Ma'am," the attendant began, her tone polite but clipped, "this jet is for private use only." Dana stopped mid-step, her head tilting slightly as she studied the attendant. Her expression didn't change, but her sharp brown eyes glimmered with quiet resolve. "I know," Dana replied evenly. Her voice carried a calm authority, the kind that had commanded boardrooms and closed multimillion-dollar deals. But the flight attendant either didn't notice or didn't care. She glanced over her shoulder toward the pilot, who stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest and his brows furrowed. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and an unspoken exchange passed between them. When the attendant turned back to Dana, her smile had thinned further, and her tone was decidedly less accommodating. "Perhaps you're lost," she said, a faint edge creeping into her voice. "This jet belongs to one of our premium clients. Unless you're on the guest list." Dana raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but tinged with curiosity. "Guest list," she repeated softly, as if the words themselves amused her. "Yes," the attendant replied firmly. "The owner has very strict policies about who's allowed on board." The pilot stepped forward then, his polished shoes clicking against the tarmac as he joined the conversation. He gave Dana a quick once-over, his gaze lingering just a fraction of a second too long on her casual but elegant attire. "I'm sorry, but we can't let you board," he said, his tone firm. "This jet isn't available for public use. Perhaps you've mistaken it for another charter." Dana didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the moment hang in the air, the tension building as she reached into her designer handbag. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, and carried an air of authority that seemed to clash with the way the crew was treating her. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the clipboard. The pilot glanced at his watch, a faint frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. Dana finally pulled out a sleek black leather case and unzipped it with precision. From inside, she withdrew a stack of documents and held them out to the flight attendant. "Here," she said simply. The attendant hesitated before taking the papers. Her eyes schemed the text, her expression shifting subtly as she read. At first, there was confusion, then disbelief, and finally, something closer to panic. This says," the attendant began, but her voice trailed off. She turned to the pilot, her face pale. The pilot stepped closer, snatching the papers from her hands. He scanned the document quickly, his brows furrowing deeper with each line. When he finally looked up, his earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a mix of uncertainty and frustration. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Dana crossed her arms, her expression calm but unyielding. "I didn't get it," she replied evenly. "I signed it." The pilot blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You signed it?" he echoed, his voice faltering. "Yes," Dana said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Because I own this jet." For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of distant engines as other jets taxied across the tarmac. The flight attendant's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. The pilot, on the other hand, seemed determined to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child, "there's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding. This jet belongs to..." He trailed off, glancing at the papers in his hand again. His face twisted into a mask of confusion as he read the name printed in bold letters at the top of the ownership document, Dana Richards. "That's my name," Dana said, her voice cutting through the awkward silence. The flight attendant's cheeks flushed a deep red. She clutched her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her earlier composure now completely shattered. "But," she stammered, "I thought..." "You thought what?" Dana asked, her tone deceptively gentle. She took a step closer, her eyes locking onto the attendants with an intensity that made the other woman shrink back slightly. The pilot cleared his throat, stepping between them as if to shield his colleague. "Ms. Richards," he began, forcing a tight smile, "I apologize for the confusion. It's just that we weren't expecting..." "Expecting what?" Dana interrupted, her gaze now fixed on him. "Expecting the owner of this jet to show up? Or expecting the owner to look like me?" The pilot's mouth opened, but no words came out. Dana sighed, her expression softening slightly, though her tone remained firm. "I'm used to this, you know," she said, her voice carrying a note of weariness. "People assuming I don't belong. Acting like I need permission to exist in spaces I've worked hard to enter." The pilot and the flight attendant exchanged uneasy glances, neither of them willing to meet her gaze. "But here's the thing," Dana continued, her voice gaining strength. "I don't need anyone's permission. Not yours, not anyone's. I've earned my place, and I'm not about to let a couple of gatekeepers make me feel otherwise." The flight attendant opened her mouth to respond, but Dana held up a hand to stop her. "I've seen enough," Dana said simply. She turned toward the stairs, her heels clicking confidently against the pavement as she ascended toward the jet's cabin. The crew stood frozen in place, their earlier arrogance now replaced by a palpable sense of unease. As Dana ascended the steps to her jet, her confidence unmistakable, the pilot and the flight attendant exchanged panicked glances. "What do we do?" the flight attendant whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of engines in the distance. The pilot shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I don't know. But we can't just let this slide. There's got to be some kind of mistake. People don't just show up claiming they own jets." "But she had the papers," the attendant hissed. "Her name's on them." "Maybe they're forged," the pilot shot back, though his voice lacked conviction. He glanced toward the cabin door, which Dana had just disappeared through. "I'll make a call. Get this sorted." Inside the jet, Dana was greeted by an interior that radiated luxury, plush leather seats, sleek wood paneling, and state-of-the-art amenities that made the cabin feel more like a high-end lounge than an aircraft. She ran her fingers lightly over the armrest of a seat, her expression unreadable. This jet wasn't just a status symbol, it was a testament to how far she had come. Every detail had been carefully selected, every inch of the space a reminder of the sacrifices and sleepless nights that had led her here. But now, instead of enjoying her hard-earned success, she was being questioned. Again. Dana took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had faced bigger challenges than this. The opinions of a dismissive crew weren't going to rattle her. Outside, the pilot had stepped away, his phone pressed to his ear. He was pacing now, his polished shoes scuffing against the tarmac as he spoke in hushed but urgent tones. "Yes, she says she's the owner," he said, glancing nervously toward the jet. "She had paperwork. But we weren't notified about any changes in management or, no, I'm not saying she's lying, but..." He paused, listening to the person on the other end of the line. His expression darkened. "Yes, I'll check. But this isn't protocol. You can't just..." He stopped mid-sentence, his jaw tightening. "Understood." When he returned to the flight attendant, his frustration was evident. "Well," she asked, her voice tense. "They said her name's on the registry," he admitted grudgingly. "But I still don't get why we weren't informed." The attendant frowned, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline. "So, she's really the owner?" The pilot didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and headed toward the stairs. Back inside the cabin, Dana was seated now, her legs crossed elegantly as she typed on her tablet. She didn't look up when the pilot entered, though she was acutely aware of his presence. "Ms. Richards," he began, his voice forcedly polite, "I just wanted to confirm, these documents. They do appear to check out." Dana looked up, her expression calm but piercing. "Appear to," she echoed, her tone carrying just enough edge to make him shift uncomfortably. The pilot cleared his throat. "What I mean is, everything seems to be in order. But there was some confusion about your arrival today. Normally, the owner of an aircraft like this would inform us in advance." Dana raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let me stop you right there," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't about confusion. It's about the assumptions you made the moment you saw me." The pilot opened his mouth to protest, but Dana held his gaze, her expression unyielding. "You assumed I didn't belong here," she continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "You saw a black woman walking up to a private jet, and you decided I had to be in the wrong place. Am I wrong?" The pilot hesitated, his face reddening. "I didn't mean..." "You didn't have to," Dana said, her words cutting through his excuses like a knife. "Your actions spoke for you." The flight attendant appeared in the doorway then, her eyes wide as she realized she had walked in on a conversation she probably shouldn't have. Dana glanced at her briefly before turning back to the pilot. "Here's what's going to happen," Dana said, her tone now laced with the kind of authority that left no room for argument. "You're going to gather your crew, and you're going to apologize for assuming, for dismissing, and for wasting my time." The pilot stiffened, his pride clearly bristling at the command. But before he could respond, Dana leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto his with a quiet intensity. "And if that doesn't happen," she added, her voice soft but deadly serious, "you won't have to worry about this job much longer." "Understood." The pilot swallowed hard, his earlier bravado now entirely absent. "Understood," he muttered, barely audible. Minutes later, the entire crew stood assembled at the foot of the jet stairs, their faces a mix of embarrassment and unease. The flight attendant kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her clipboard clutched tightly in front of her like a shield. The pilot stood rigidly, his hands clasped behind his back. Dana stepped out onto the top of the stairs, her presence commanding even without a word. She looked down at the crew, her expression unreadable. "Well," she prompted, raising an eyebrow. The pilot cleared his throat awkwardly before speaking. "Ms. Richards," he began, his voice strained, "on behalf of the crew, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. It was unprofessional and inappropriate." Dana's gaze swept over the group, her silence stretching just long enough to make them squirm. Finally, she nodded. Good, she said simply. She descended the stairs with measured grace, stopping a few feet away from the crew. For a moment, no one moved. Then Dana spoke again, her voice calm but firm. Let this be a reminder, she said, her words deliberate, that respect isn't optional. Not for me, and not for anyone else who walks through your doors. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the crew standing in silence, their earlier arrogance now replaced by the weight of their own actions. The rising tension around Dana was palpable. The murmurs in the background grew into a soft chorus of disbelief and judgment. Nearby passengers, staff, and even a few onlookers from other parts of the tarmac turned their attention to the unfolding drama. The whispers were relentless. Does she even know where she is? Maybe she's just posing for social media or something. She must be one of those influencers looking for attention, someone chuckled dismissively. Dana let their words roll off her back like water on stone. She had heard worse before and had long since